Welcome to HortTube. My name is John Putnam. I'm standing in a wooded area that's completely eaten with English ivy, to tell you not to plant English ivy. But this is going to be a video with, I think, 20 plus ground covers for shady spaces. I've included a couple very low growing shrubs and then a few non-aggressive clumping type perennials. And then there's a couple things in here that, if given time, could take over some space for sure. So, you want to make sure you're staying on top and controlling ground covers. Anytime we put something in that has the potential to really spread and maybe have a negative impact on our neighbors and that kind of thing, we definitely want to be keeping an eye on them on a year-to-year basis for sure. But some of these things in this video may help you reduce the amount of mulch you're using, give you some year-round interest in your shady spaces. And these are going to be things that stay under, 18 inches in height for the most part, maybe 2 feet max here in this video. Most of it requires very limited maintenance, but again, I would say every so often you're going to want to get a little control over your ground covers. Standing in a big group of beautiful Everillo carax, actually shooting this in February, so they're not quite as vivid bright as they are 7 to 8 months out of the year. These will start to get some new growth on them in the next month or so, and really have the chartreuse, very bright chartreuse color all season long. They do get a flower. This is, carax are grass-like plants, but they're actually in their own plant family. They do get a flower spike on them in the fall. It's not very interesting overall. These are mainly grown for this evergreen, bright chartreuse pop of color. Lots and lots of caraxes being added to gardens all over the country now. Variegated ones and green ones, some native, some non-native. They're caraxes from all over the world. We don't need to necessarily cut ours back in zone 8 in Raleigh. These are hardy in zone 5 to 9. Typically in zone 5, they'll get killed back pretty hard and they can be cut back. It depends on where you are and how they look coming out of winter as to whether or not you need to cut them back or not. Be careful when you do cut them back. This is not a plant that you cut down way down into the bottom of it, like only an inch tall. Leave it up just a little bit. So just basically cut it in. This is a prostrate plum yew, or Japanese plum yew. These come in fastigiate selections that are straight up and down, and then ones that get 2 to 3 feet and 3 to 4 feet. This plant has a lot of different shapes and sizes, but this prostrate plum yew we will frequently see on, I would say, the majority of shade gardens that we cover in the Southeast. If they have dry shade or a bank or a slope or somewhere where it's not staying evenly moist throughout the season, these prostrate plum yews are going to be used. And it's just such a great plant for that, for covering up some ground in a difficult, maybe a space that has some root competition in shade or park shade conditions. Super, super slow growing. So this is one of those plants I like to say occasionally, there's a reason this is going to cost more than other things. I've rooted these things and had them take 2.5 years or more to fill a 1 gallon container. And so this is a 3 gallon, a squat 3 gallon container. From a rooted cutting, this could be as much as 3 to even 4 years to have a finished 3 gallon container. It's not a lot of work out here because they're not demanding, and it won't be demanding for you either in the ground. Really super, super low maintenance plant. In the future, it may get a little wider than you want it. It's going to be a while, but if it ever does, you can just prune this thing back and shape it back into, narrow it back in with a pair of pruners pretty much any time, spring or early summer, without any problem. I always say things that are drought tolerant, like this one is, you do need to keep an eye on it to start with. I mean, if you're putting it in an area with root competition, it's going to take a minute for it to get rooted into place. But once it is, this is a really, really great plant. And what I really love, and what Steph and I really love about this plant, is the texture it offers. A lot of things that we put in shady spaces are going to have big, like palmate leaves, like a fatsia or something like that. And you imagine you take something that's tropical looking like that and you put it with something that's soft textured looking like this. And this thing actually is soft to the touch. Looks kind of spiny probably in the video, but it's actually soft to the touch. You put those things together and create those contrast and these different shades of green that we can have in shady spaces, and you can really make a shady space pop, with or without flowers. Here's a collection of Hookera. There are kind of coppery colored foliage ones and gold or chartreuse colored foliage ones, dark green. We get purple foliage. We've seen so much breeding on heucheras, and we'll also see some heucherellas as well, which is a cross between heuchera and tiarella. But these are heucheras here, and again, when you go to shop for them, you're going to see a ton of them. They're branded ones and non-branded ones, old ones and new ones. We really struggle growing heuchera in our Raleigh, North Carolina garden because it's a very flat space. And I find, especially if you go back and look at a video that we did over in the Charlotte area with a beautiful garden that we toured with Jay Sifford, he had all his heucheras in that garden planted on a slope out front down to the street. So this is a part shade evergreen native that would prefer good drainage. So moist but well drained, and that can be a tricky kind of thing for us, right? If we have moist conditions in our flat clay spaces in Raleigh, they tend to get root rot and die. But in a slightly sloped space where the water just kind of moves, you know, down the slope over time. So they're not sitting in yesterday's water, right? They're sitting in, you know, they're sitting in water that was a little further up the hill the day before. That's the thing. So moist but good drainage in between rains and waterings is the kind of key to growing heuchera. They will flower, but I tell you what, you know, and they're great for pollinators, but I would grow these things now. So much breeding has gone into this foliage color that really this year-round impact. I'm filming this in February. Look how beautiful they are in February. Outdoors, they're not even protected. There's not a cover in sight here at this nursery over near Charlotte. So this is just great year-round color for the garden as long as you've got a space. Again, a little bit of slope on it if you have clay soils. This is one of the great evergreen ferns. This is Autumn Brilliance fern. You see in filming this in February, and it has this really rich green coloration on it. These are outdoors, unprotected in Charlotte, North Carolina, so they've seen 13, 14 degrees on them during the winter time. And they have this really rich green color. But as the new growth starts to emerge in the spring, it's like this coppery red color that takes over this plant and stays on it through the spring and into early summer, and then it matures back into this green color. But it's incredibly showy in shady areas, part shaded areas, and very shady spaces. Even moisture is kind of the key. Would not like to be in a really, really dry shaded space at all, nor would it want to sit in water. So if you have a part shade or shady space that's kind of evenly moist, consistently moist throughout the year, this is a great plant for that. And it's green year round like this, looks fantastic. Maintenance wise, if you've got any kind of tattered fronds, you know, coming out of winter, you can cut those to the ground, but anything that looks reasonably fresh, you can just leave it on it, and all that new growth that comes up from the ground in the spring and early summer has this tremendous color on it. This is a really nice group of cast iron plants. This is Aspidistra elatior. There's lots of different species of cast iron plants on the market. They have various size, various heights, various thickness on the foliage. Elatior tends to be the main one sold in the commercial trade when you go and shop for plants. Big, broad, big, broad leaves on them. You'll see variegated ones, striped ones, spotted ones, all kinds of different things here. And again, there are other species and other growth habits. They do flower down at the base, and Steph has actually found one of the flowers here in the container. So you got to get down right down to the ground level to see that thing in flower, and they're actually super, super interesting flowers on them. And again, most of the time when we go to retail and look for cast iron plants, we're going to see green ones like this. One thing I'll say is that they need to be cleaned up in late winter. I've shown it on the channel many times. We just go in and right down at the base, take a pruning knife or pruners, however you want to do it, and take out the old tattered leaves right down to the ground. And then you can choose to save all of the good looking ones from late last year, or you can cut them all to the ground if you want to. There are places that we see frequently where they have not been maintained or not been pruned in years. Those are areas that I think should just be probably completely cut back to the ground. You'll also get the opportunity coming out of winter to see those interesting flowers down at the ground level by having cut it back or got in there and thinned them out. But really interesting plant, green year round like this. The new foliage is super fresh, and Again, you can find these if you really get out and search beyond just the green Aspidistra ladior like this. You can find so many other interesting ones. Some slightly more cold hardy than others. So if you're in zone 7, make sure you're getting ones for zone 7. If you're in zone 8, make sure you're getting ones for zone 8, because there's some that are only hardy to like zone 9. So keep that in mind. This is Carax Feather Falls, and you can see it has the green center and then kind of a yellowish gold edge on it. It tends to be a little, the new growth tends to be a little more white in the spring, and then it settles into that kind of yellowish color during the winter time. There's a reverse variegation of this, or a slightly different variegation of this, also on the market, and then a solid green one called Ribbon Falls. But it's Feather Falls, Moon Falls, Ribbon Falls. All of them have a lot of what I would call hybrid vigor. They're very fast growing, so a lot of the caraxes, lots of different caraxes from all over the world, including native and non-native ones, but there's some hybridizing going on that's created some hybrid vigor, where we see caraxes now getting, you know, this one is probably 2 feet wide in our garden and 1.5 feet tall, something like that. They do flower. Flower's kind of insignificant down in the plant like that. It's not, you know, not particular. There are interesting carax out there that do have more interesting flowers on them, and we've shown a couple of those off in the on the channel before. But this one's just mainly grown for this, you know, lacy, you know, variegated foliage. It's like this year round. I'm filming this in February. How could you lose with a plant that looks like this in February? You can choose whether or not to cut them back based on how good they look coming out of winter. So if they're rough looking coming out of winter, you can cut them back. Don't cut them way down to the ground. Leave them up just to, you know, like this. And then new growth will emerge from that if you need to, but we haven't had to cut our Feather Falls back. I think at some point though, we'll have to pop it out of the ground and divide it at some point, because it is, again, a much more vigorous carax than others. This is Carax Flocka Blue Zinger. It has this blue coloration to it. It was selected because it's a more compact, well, actually slightly more vigorous form, but it also has a compact habit as well of this particular species. There are a lot of species, like 3,000 species or something of carax, and it's bizarre that 20 or 30 years ago we weren't using any carax in our gardens, and now people are really just all in on caraxes. It's absolutely amazing. This one will adapt to some dry shade. That's the one thing about this particular species, is it will adapt to some dry shade, where some of the others require some more consistent moisture to really perform well in the garden. So based on, you know, look up and see, you know, what, you know, if you have dry shade conditions or you have moist shade conditions, make sure you're buying plants. There are definitely 2 sets of plants for dry shade and moist or wet shade. Make sure you're paying attention to that as you're developing your garden. You'll find that some plants just really struggle in dry shade. This one is, again, is an adaptable species to that, where some of the other caraxes are just not. They're all mostly understory plants all over the globe. This is Dwarf Sweetbox or Himalayan Sweetbox, really super compact, lustrous green foliage evergreen that is for shade or part shade conditions typically, slightly moist, not super, super dry shade, but really great evergreen foliage. It doesn't, you know, it's hard to find sometimes low growing evergreen things for the for our shady conditions. What makes this one really unique is we're filming this in February, and you can see flower buds forming along the stems here. Super, super, really in winter. I mean, it's late winter when it blooms, but in winter, these get like a vanilla scented white flower. And this is one of those plants you could walk by it 10 times and not necessarily see the flowers on it because they're down in the plant just a little bit, but you will smell them. It will feel, you know, it's very, very aromatic. I really love this shrub for, you know, because again, we don't necessarily have a tremendous amount of low evergreen things that we can have in shady spaces, ground covers with this kind of lustrous, you know, green foliage, and on something that won't get out of control. So it does spread, and it spreads by, you know, it's slowly but surely, like right there is a piece coming up on the edge of this one, on the edge of that container, but it's a very, very slow spread. So 10 years would go by before you'd need to add any control to this thing. So that's another nice thing about presenting ground covers for the shade that won't eat your entire shade garden. This is a dwarf Gumpo azalea. These are fantastic for part shade conditions where you want an evergreen shrub that's only going to get, you know, you can keep these less than a foot in height, you know, up to maybe 18 inches, possibly 2 feet in time, typically much wider than tall, and you can see that's how it's growing in this container. There are white gumpos and pink gumpos, and then a few other dwarfs as well out on the market. Much smaller leaves, really tight, you know, really tight habit on these. After they bloom in the spring, you can give these a little bit of a haircut, and that'll keep them a little bit fuller. I see a lot of them in landscapes where they've gotten thin over time, where they're 3 or 4 feet wide, but they're very thin toward the middle. I think a seasonal haircut after they flower is a good idea on these. Abnormally large flowers for such a small leaf and such a small plant. And they basically just kind of cover up in flowers if they're full like this. If they're full like this, when they come into full flower. These tend to bloom a little later. And I'm going to tell you there's a huge advantage to having an azalea, a spring blooming azalea that blooms a little later, because sometimes we're in a field of azaleas right now, and a lot of these azaleas will try to bloom, you know, second week of March, a lot of times in the Raleigh area, and we still have the chance for pretty heavy freezes, you know, right through the beginning of April, and those open flowers will get burned. But these Gumpo azaleas typically don't bloom until almost May, late April, early May, and that tends to that prevents them from getting as damaged as a lot of the other azaleas do. This is one of our absolute favorite low doming evergreen shrubs. This is Mojo pittosporum. We have 4 of these in our garden in Raleigh, and we have one of everything. So if we have more than one of something, you know, we definitely like it. Love this plant for part shade or shade conditions. This variegation is changeable during the season. So the oldest growth is because it's off-white variegation, but when it's actively growing, the variegation is more of a gold on green. It does flower. It gets a fragrant flower down inside the shrub that you'll smell. Probably takes a few years on these dwarf ones to get to the point where they're going to flower. Again, flower's insignificant, but you'll smell it. But we really love this just for its evergreen low doming habit. We have 3 of them together in one spot that are covering about 9-10 square feet. We don't have to weed, don't have to think about. It's not much taller than it is in this container right here. It's probably less than 2 feet in height and probably 3.5 feet in width, and 4 years in the ground without having to do any pruning on it. This is a plant I don't know if I've ever talked about on the channel. This is Asiatic jasmine. You'll see green foliage, Asiatic jasmine, and now lots and lots of new variegated ones out on the market, and the variegated ones tend to be changeable during the growing season to where the new growth is kind of pink, and then they'll settle into these variegated, you know, whitish and off-white leaves, and then it'll settle in the oldest growth into green. So it creates this kind of layered, multicolored ground cover. And I think there's one called Snow in Summer that's become very, very popular. That may be what this is. It's not labeled here. And these are small, newly planted containers, so this isn't particularly, you know, the best advertisement for this plant. But we see this plant being used in really difficult shade conditions in our neighborhood where it's well drained. We'll see this on a slope down to the street if somebody's house is kind of elevated above the street and they're got kind of a shady bank. Kind of perfect conditions for that. We'll see these growing under trees at the Ralston Arboretum where, you know, really, you know, some maple planted in a contained space, and there's just nothing else would grow under it. These Asiatic jasmine do well in those conditions. They're hardy in zone 7 to 9. They're evergreen. And, you know, one thing I'll say is like any other ground cover, you know, this could get bigger than you want at some point. So you'll want to put it in an area maybe where you'll have some check or control on it. Like don't plant them next to the woods, next to your house, you know, plant it out by the street. If you had a shady hell strip area between the curb and the sidewalk at your house or something like that, that's where they're being used effectively in our neighborhood in Raleigh, where it's just super, super tough conditions in the shade. This is black mondo grass, typically used as a ground cover to provide texture and foliage color and color contrast with maybe other things that are chartreuse color or green color in a part shade or shade conditions. Typically it'll reach about 5 to 6 inches in height, something like that. It spreads, but spreads very slowly. So over time, this will become as wide of a clump as you want it to get, but again, it's going to be super, super slow to get there. It has a clumping habit and just slowly from the bottom produces new foliage and gets slightly wider over time. It gets these kind of lavender flower spike on it. It's a little bit showy than some other the flowers on some of the other mondo grasses. I would actually call this a kind of a showy flowering plant. And then the flowers kind of open purple above the foliage, which is kind of quite striking. These are hardy in zones 5 to 10. Where you're going to put it in the landscape probably depends on what zone you're in. So if you're in zone 5, these can take quite a bit of sun. By the time you're down to zone 10, this is definitely a shade plant for sure. Again, we've planted several of these in our Raleigh garden. And 2 years later, they're barely bigger than when we put them in the ground. So how many of these you buy to make an impact is probably going to matter. It's going to take a while for them to make an impact. So you're going to probably want to buy more of these clumps if you're trying to cover a larger area for sure. They're great planted in mass. They're great as a contrasting plant with other foliage colors. So you can see it, this black mondo sitting next to a gold Chartreuse colored grass-like plant, and you see how good that contrast looks. They're great container plants. Again, great ground cover. Typically going to be used in Asian gardens quite a bit. Edging, so along the edge of any kind of sidewalk or patio, perfect for that. And again, along a pond edge is another place you're typically going to see these. They need to be in kind of evenly moist soil. They will become sort of drought tolerant in time, but initially just keep them moist but not wet. And it's going to take a little while for them to become established and to really put on any growth. Virtually no maintenance to do. In the future, once the clump gets pretty big, you can pop it out of the ground and divide it in the late winter, early spring, but you can divide them every 2 or 3 years and get new plants out of them. We fertilize our entire garden once a year with an organic fertilizer. It probably doesn't need any of that. They're disease resistant, typically resistant for snail and slugs, and they're considered deer and rabbit resistant, but I will occasionally see rabbit eat mondo grass out in the garden. But this is black mondo grass. This is Disperopsis pernii, otherwise known as evergreen Solomon seal or false Solomon seal. Happens to be in the same family as Solomon seal, but it is a different genus. This is a great plant. This is about as tall as you'll see it in the garden, right around 1 foot in height, but it is a herbaceous perennial that spreads by rhizome, so it will get wider in time. Again, it stays evergreen. Some of the stems can ultimately get a little tired on it. You can just cut those to the ground in the late winter. That's about all the maintenance you have to do on this plant ultimately. It develops flowers along the stems, pretty showy flowers that happen in the middle spring into maybe early summer, and then that develops into a blue or purple fruit in the fall. Really great plant, and they can really grow in some pretty tough conditions. We'll see them used in our neighborhood between the sidewalk and the street, and can really fill that area in, prevent it from getting weeds, and just kind of take care of a problem area in the garden. Typically we'll see these paired in part shade or shade conditions with hosta and other shade perennials. A great kind of evergreen. It's flowering, but it's not really so much that we're thinking about this as a flowering plant as we're thinking about it as a kind of an evergreen backdrop to our other herbaceous perennials in those spaces. Likes moist, well-drained conditions, but can become drought tolerant in time. So over a period of don't turn your back on it initially, but over time, it can start to compete with tree roots and other things in your garden. If you need to divide them late winter, early spring, you can pop these out of the ground. You can cut them into as many pieces as you want, put them back in the garden, give them away to friends, whatever you want to do. It's a great textured plant, beautiful dark green foliage. Really always have been drawn to these because it's one of those super, super low maintenance plants that's deer resistant and rabbit resistant. Has a lot of those ornamental garden qualities that we look for, where we can kind of plant it and forget it. And then again, just the occasional watering on this thing, the occasional stem that needs to be cut down to the ground, the occasional division if it needs it. But that's evergreen Solomon seal. This is Ophiopogon japonicus nana, or otherwise known as dwarf mondo grass. This is an alternative for lawns in shady spaces, or something that can be put between rocks in Asian gardens and along stream beds. Any place you're looking for some sort of really compact growing grass-like plant that can cover some ground, maybe prevent some weeds in spaces. A little bit slow growing, typically is going to be about 3 inches in height, something like that. It can creep up a bit if it's got competition around it. You know, it can creep up a bit more than that in height. It has kind of an insignificant flower on it, followed by a kind of a metallic blue berry on it. I don't see as many berries on the dwarf mondo grass as I see on some of the upright mondo grasses or other types of mondo grass as well. This is a very, very popular plant in zone 6 to 10. In zone 6, it can go in a little more sun, but as you get further south, you definitely in part shade or shade conditions. Again, how many of these you're going to need to make a lawn or put between your walkways is really going to be up to your budget as much as anything. They're pretty slow growing, so this thing is going to slowly but surely be bigger and bigger each year, but it's going to take a while. But you can buy one of these containers like this that's full. Okay, hopefully you can find small containers like this and you can actually break it into pieces. You can get real greedy and get a lot of pieces, or you can just break it into maybe 2 or 3 good-sized chunks, up to you. And you could grow it out in containers for a little while and then, you know, plant it later. But again, I always got that question about how close to put them together. It's really going to be, you know, how many of them can you buy? Because the closer together, the better. These are salt tolerant. Really deer resistant, considered rabbit resistant, although I see a little bit of rabbit damage on them occasionally. Moist conditions, moist well-drained conditions is kind of ideal. But do become reasonably drought tolerant. I see this really looking pretty good in gardens that aren't really, you know, manicured in any way. It tends to be self-maintaining once established. But while you're in the process of trying to get them established and get them growing and get them moving, you're going to want to do some additional watering on them if it's abnormally dry outside. We'll put organic fertilizer on these at the end of winter. Wash it in. I don't want that fertilizer sitting on top of these, because that's what it's going to do. It's just going to mat right on top of it, potentially burn that foliage. So get it washed down in there or use a rake. Maintenance-wise, get the leaves off of it. Typically in a shady area, we're going to have leaves in the fall, so we want to rake those leaves off of it. Fertilize it once a year. And sometime in the way out in the future, if you thought it was getting a little messy looking, you could cut it down a little bit if you wanted to with a mower once and let it kind of regenerate itself in that space as an option. Slugs can be an issue on anything that's growing this thick. Anything that's growing this thick and potentially in a moist, shady condition could have slug issues. But other than that, really not much to do here, and just such a great plant for covering some ground with a really dark green coloration and preventing weeds in that space. This is Selaginella brownii, otherwise known as Arborvitae fern. It's neither an Arborvitae or a fern. It's actually a club moss. It has spores like a fern, but it's not a fern. Super, super soft to the touch. Typically used as an evergreen ground cover in a part shade or shade conditions. It will take moist, well-drained soil, but I have found that it actually doesn't mind being in slightly dry, shady spaces either. Once it gets established, you need to do a little more watering right when you plant it though. Beautiful green foliage on this plant during the summertime, and then it turns this russet color in the winter. It's hardy in zone 6 to 9, and up in zone 6, it can look a little ratty toward the end of winter, potentially in a very cold winter. But for everyone else, it just looks great right through the winter time. Really almost no maintenance to do on this. If something looks bad on it, you can cut it right down to the ground. It can be dug up and divided. If you're using it as a ground cover, they'd be planted about 2 to 3 feet apart and would fill in easily. These are pest resistant, deer resistant, rabbit resistant. All we do on these is fertilize them once in the late winter, and we keep it weeded and keep it mulched, and this Selaginella brownii or Arborvitae fern just performs fantastic in our shade garden. This is Angiostar fatshedera from the Southern Living Plant Collection, a intergenus hybrid between Fatsia japonica, which is a shrub, and ivy, which is a climber spreading plant. It gets the best of both worlds from the 2 parent plants. It can climb on things, but you have to attach it. It doesn't attach itself up there, so it doesn't do damage to your structure. it has sterile seed. It has flowers in the fall that produce seed. The pollinators love the flowers, the birds love the seed, but they're sterile, so it's not going to spread itself all over the place like ivy. And then there's been a bunch of selections like Angiostar here that have these beautiful variegations, and this one is just one of the tops. It starts off with kind of a yellow and green variegation and settles into kind of an off-white and green variegation. And again, this is an evergreen. It's hardy in zone 7B to 9 or 7B to 10. In zone 7, I would probably spring plant it because it is a little winter sensitive. It needs to go in a shady space, which is where we've got it in a perfect ideal conditions here. It's getting about 2 or 2.5 hours of direct sun. And I think it does need that a little bit of direct sun to keep this really vibrant color. I think it's a little more dull in shadier conditions. We're using it to climb on the corner of our screen porch here, but it can be used as a ground cover. It can be used in a container. It can be used as an indoor plant in colder areas where it can be outside and then brought inside. It can be limbed up into kind of a small tree form. All kinds of uses for this plant. And it's one of these 4-season plants. It's always doing something. It's super, super interesting. And we just love it. This is Angiostar fatshedera. Standing in some Farfugium japonicum, sometimes the larger leafed variety will be called a tractor seat plant. You can kind of see why. And this is a small version of this. Once they're in the ground for a little while, get established a bit, the leaf can be quite large and really shiny and dark green. They're in containers here in the winter time as we're filming this, and so they're not completely they're not putting on new growth right now, so they don't look as good as they do in the ground. There's a few interesting things about these. These are going to be hardy in like zone 8 to 10 typically. There are a lot of different versions of this. So you can have the gigantium, the one that's, with the tractor seat plant that has the leaves that are this big. And then there are spotted ones and striped ones and all kinds of different variegations, from yellow variegations and creamy white variegations. There's even one that looks kind of like lettuce called crispata. Wasn't that the name of it? Crispata. Super, super interesting plant. In our Raleigh garden, some of them will get killed completely to the ground and some won't. And then as you move further south, they're more reliably evergreen. But our Raleigh garden is about as far north as typically they would grow, and maybe over to Norfolk and then down into the southeast. Love this plant. It's a great shade perennial. What's one of the great things about it, and there's a few flowers happening in here right now, but really this plant in the ground, not in a greenhouse where it's being fooled by various climate issues in a greenhouse where it can stay too warm at times. This bloom in the fall, and they bloom late in the fall. In fact, we sometimes, Steph and I will do some traveling typically in October and November, and we miss the flowering on our Farfugium most years because it blooms super, super late. About the last herbaceous or non-woody plant in the garden to bloom every year. And the pollinators absolutely take full advantage of that. Despite this being a Japanese, or Asian native, these flowers are great for native and honeybees, which are not native, and other native bees take advantage of it, of this Farfugium. It's just an interesting plant. I don't think, again, as it warms up in the next few weeks and these get some new growth on them, they'll look much better as they go out to retail. It's just a winter, kind of a winter look on them right now. Here's a heucherella called Tapestry, and we've shown this one on the channel a bunch because we have it in our Raleigh garden. It will change all kinds of color changes during the season. This is February and we're in a fairly dark house here in South Georgia, but it will get this really great purple coloration in the center of the leaf and get brighter, and of course flower. Heucherellas are a cross between Hookera and Tiarella. Heucherella and Hookera for us, and Tiarella, really, we need well-drained conditions, and growing them, I find growing them in flat space with a clay-based soil is not necessarily the best place. We did that video with Jay Sifford over in Charlotte, and he had all the Heucheras planted on a slope in the front of that beautiful Charlotte garden tour. If you haven't seen that, you can look it up on the channel, just Charlotte garden tour, I'm sure would be enough with HortTube, and you'd find that video. That video's been watched a lot. That garden's beautiful, but planting that Hookera on that bank in Charlotte, it just is absolutely stunning how big the leaves are, how great it looked overall. But again, we have struggle in our flat, very, very flat garden in Raleigh to grow these. Of course, they're great for pollinators. They need part shade. I'm going to go back here and grab one that's got a flower spike on it. So I don't know, you know, it's not necessarily for us visually the most striking flowering thing, but for the pollinators, they love it. And for us, it's about that foliage and all the different foliage colors we can get. Summing all this up, this Tapestry variety has been really, really good in our Raleigh garden, where we have lost several others over time. Alabama Sunrise is the other one, Steph, right? That's really pretty good. And this Tapestry variety we have found to really tolerate our clay-based soil and perform really, really well in the garden. We definitely have to include the Ajuga in the ground cover video for shade. These are in the Lamiaceae or the mint family, and so they typically don't get eaten by deer or rabbits. They, you know, pretty long bloomed. They'll bloom for us coming right out of winter, just before our average last frost date, sometime late March into middle April. And then the foliage looks great the rest of the season. These come in black foliage varieties and green foliage, and typically a bluish flower spike on them. That's pretty typical, but also pink foliage varieties and all kinds of different, we see all kinds of different variegations in these, and just a million different ways you can have Ajuga in your garden. Virtually no maintenance. They don't like the leaves sitting on top of them. So we typically will try to get the leaves off of them, because when we're growing things in ground covers in shady spaces, that's the one area we can have issues, is they get buried in leaves, you know, when the trees lose their leaves. But they need this late winter sun. Typically is when they flower, and they tend to come out and look really, really fresh and great as they're flowering in the early part of the season. Then of course the trees leaf out, and you know, it's just a nice ground cover to have. They'll take a little bit of light foot traffic, but not something you can walk on a whole lot. But if you occasionally step on one, it's, you know, they tend to be okay with the occasional footprint. But don't get crazy with it. I just like their resistance to you know, being salt tolerant and growing in difficult shade conditions, and then being deer and rabbit resistant. This is a Rhodia japonica, and this is a variegated one. There are literally hundreds of named varieties of Rhodia japonica. With some of them are spotted or striped or solid green. Some of them have broader foliage. Some of them have much narrower foliage. Just a lot of options in these. This is a super underused shade evergreen perennial. It's not going to be as cold tolerant as a hosta, but it's kind of a hosta replacement in the South for spaces that you know, where this stays evergreen. I'm shooting this in March, and where hostas are still asleep. This has done this all winter. They will get a red berry, a cluster of red berries on them in the fall typically, that are actually quite showy on some and not as showy on others. But I think this is a super underused plant. They're deer resistant, and that's one of the things, another thing, you know, where you're comparing this with hosta. This stays evergreen, doesn't hide in the wintertime, and the deer don't eat it. So again, I think Rhodia japonica is super, super underused. This is epimedium. This is an interesting perennial. There's 20 or 30 species, so there's lots of different ones of these out on the market, and a lot of named cultivars out there. It is flowering. You see the flowers here with my hand as a backdrop. They're interesting little four-pointed flowers that are quite showy, and you'll see, you know, shades of white and yellow and some other colors as well. We cut the foliage back on these in the late winter, similar to how we do hellebores and cast iron plants, just to clean them up. You know, some cleaning involved, and then the flowers come up and stand on their own big and tall without kind of being eaten by the foliage. Then the new foliage will come out, and it looks really fantastic all season long. Quite showy. You're going to bloom at different times depending on where you are. Here in the South in Zone 8, these are flowering right at the end of March. By the time you go much further north, they're going to be flowering more like May and maybe even into early June. But incredibly showy, interesting, tough perennials are going to spread by rhizome during the winter time, so they're going to come up a little bigger each spring. You can decide whether to get a little bit of control on that in the future. Not crazy fast. We've got some neighbors that have let theirs get out of control, and out of control on these is not bad. Nothing like English ivy out of control or vinca kind of out of control. But just beautiful, interesting, very complex, showy flowers in the late winter, and then a really interesting foliage after that. Of course, hellebores make fantastic shade ground covers. Some can seed themselves in time, so warn you that there are hellebores that can get slightly out of control in time. It takes years and years for that to happen, but it does happen, and I've seen it in some gardens happen. But a lot of these new hybrids, there's a lot of breeding going on to get the flowers up where we can see them a little more instead of nodding, you know, straight down to the ground. The foliage looks much better, and they tend to be more clumping, so they're sterile, they're not seeding themselves about, and the clump is getting slightly larger each year, so eventually you dig them up and move them about. But there's a lot of, again, a ton of breeding going on, an incredible color spectrum in hellebores. They bloom at a time when virtually nothing's blooming in the garden. For us here in Raleigh, that's February, March into April. For those of you living in more northern areas, a little bit later than that, but again, almost no maintenance. We cut the old foliage back before they start blooming in the late winter. We fertilize once a year out here, and that's about all we do on the hellebores. But I will say, I would probably concentrate on some more of these newer varieties just to make sure that they don't end up seedy in your garden. And again, some of these bloom longer, bloom more showy, as you can see right here, and also the foliage is better looking as well. So hopefully you can find something in that list that will help you in your shady areas in your garden. The weekly garden planner will give you some ideas on how to maintain those things. It's a week-by-week maintenance schedule for your garden with a little video that will help it adapt to your area. We're in Zone 8A in Raleigh, North Carolina, but if you're in colder areas or warmer areas, you can adapt the weekly garden planner to your area, and it's available over on our website at HortTube.com. So thank you guys so much for following along, and thanks for watching.